and welcome back to the Earthdawn Survival Guide, a podcast for novices, journeymen, wardens, and masters alike. Welcome to episode 25, actually. I am here in my Earthdawn Kickstarter polo shirt
I noticed
celebrate
that.
25 episodes. I am, of course, Dan. My co-host is, of course, Josh.
Hello, everybody.
And on today's podcast, we will be discussing all things magical, mechanical, cultural, civilizational, and spirithial, because we're going to get to elves later on. But first, we have a couple of emails to get to, and I think only really one question, so just some glowing emails. And then Josh has a little sidebar he'd like to discuss because current conversations and other social media are bleeding into Josh's brain, and he wants to clear the air. So,
yeah.
We will absolutely, because it's Josh's podcast, let him get to that. So first email comes in from Spencer, and then Rob. So we're doing this in reverse alphabetical order. But Spencer just wanted to drop us a line, let us know he's a new fan of the podcast and appreciates the time we both have put into it. He got into Earthdawn back in first edition, yay, and have quite a bit of the collection, but it's been collecting dust over the years. Sorry. With the coronavirus happening, he's actually had a chance to get back with some of his old friends and is starting a new Earthdawn campaign now.
Yay!
Applause all around. He had no clue there was still activity on the Earthdawn, and the podcast is an awesome source of information. I thank Josh for that. It also helps to have it in audio, so he can do some mindless work while he listens to the show. None of it's mindless, especially if you're doing anything with Earthdawn. But he's psyched Earthdawn has lasted and is still being produced. He even found and contributed to the most recent Kickstarter campaign for Iopos.
Which, as of the release of this episode, closed a few days ago.
Yes.
It is not as of the recording of this episode. But if you are hearing this and you missed out, you have not completely missed out. You will still be able to get the book.
Buy the book.
Just keep an eye out. Make sure you're following social medias and FASA on Facebook and me on Twitter and FASA on Twitter and maybe the forums and the Discord and blah, blah, blah. We
will.
You
can't find us, you're not trying.
Yeah. If you've got this podcast, there is plenty of opportunity for you to find other locations for us to shill at you.
And hint, hint, email us. But otherwise, Spencer just says thanks, and we're doing an awesome show. So thank you, Spencer. We appreciate it.
No questions. He just wanted to say thanks, and we appreciate that.
And we'll take that. It's a nice little boost in the ego there to say we're doing a decent job. So on to Rob, who is a frequent emailer. How's that?
At least the second time.
At least the second time, so we'll go with that. Regarding Josh's convention game being recorded as actual play, he should clarify what he had in mind was recording a session over Discord with some FASA freelancers as players or otherwise outside the convention setting itself. Recording an actual convention would be certainly too much of a production, which we went into
We discussed, in his first email.
He says he thinks having an actual play example would also be helpful for 1879, for what it's worth. And I think on that one, we need to get a hold of, I can't remember. Andrew. God bless America. Couldn't remember.
There are,
Big fan
I will not venture into speaking for what they may want to do as far as that goes. But yeah, I do know that there are 1879. There's on the FASA Discord, there's a 1879 game that runs semi-regularly. And when they finish a story arc, they are will take on a new cast member or two if people want to give that a try.
Cool.
And I absolutely. The other thing perhaps is I know that Andrew on his blog, on the 1879 blog, did several blog entries that were basically like a written up example of play. So that may be something to look at.
I have not had the time to divest into learning more about 1879, but I was almost hired as one of the freelancers for it. And then I got sidetracked into another project. However, question from Rob. Any chance that the Earthdawn Survival Guide, you and me, will ever do an overview of the connections with 1879?
Maybe.
As soon as Andrew reaches out to have us do a podcast for him, I'd say sure. He's the line developer for 1879, so.
Yeah. It's kind of the same way that that we could potentially go into the former connections between Earthdawn and Shadowrun.
Yeah.
It's one of those things. Yeah. So, I mean, it's not in the near future in terms of our current planned episodes, but I won't say that it won't happen. I am not hugely up on 1879 as far as a setting and whatnot. I've got so much attention that I work on. I know the general gist, and I've got a good convention pitching it to interested parties kind of situation. I know the broad strokes and I know some of the stuff of what's going on, and I've got, the books on my shelf, but I have not gotten into it in any particular depth.
Yeah, that is something, as I said, I have not had the chance to divest interest into. I am relearning all the things I have forgotten about Earthdawn in the production of this show. So my time's already taken up as far as that's concerned. But one of these days, yeah, I'll get more into 1879. So no fault of anything anybody is doing on it. I just haven't had the time because, again, I'm dusting off, like Spencer, I'm dusting off all of my Earthdawn stuff to refresh my memory so we can talk about it on this show because I don't want to lose my job. But Rob otherwise doesn't have any questions. He actually was invited to host with Crit Show to do a Earthdawn run for them. So he'll be letting us know when that happens, probably around July or something like that.
Right.
So was his, we'll let you know.
Was his Earthdawn, or was he doing a different game with them? And he was
asked by an actual play podcast to host a one-shot of Earthdawn for them sometime in June.
Ah, okay. So not Crit Show, which is who I did the game with, but with another one-shot. Yes,
he was chatting with Rev from the Crit Show, who had told him about something about your recording with them.
Right.
And then he was asked by another actual play podcast.
Gotcha.
So big roundabout of events.
It's all
Rob,
all interconnected threads in a pattern that will one day lead to the domination of the RPG industry by Earthdawn, as is our passions given right.
Preach it, brother! Preach it. I'm all there. I'm all there for that. So let's do that. So otherwise, this is going to lead into our little segue here, our second topic today.
Yeah, his question about an episode focusing on the connections between Earthdawn and 1879 does kind of lead into a topic that I wanted to address a little bit, partially because of the Iopos Sourcebook Kickstarter, and a couple of other things that I've seen online, as I kind of wanted to talk a little bit about Metaplot.
So does this involve getting on a soapbox, or
this? Yeah, there may be. No, I don't think so. I don't think I'm going to be getting onto a soapbox. I think I just kind of want to talk about.
Like I'm going to try and rein you in. Come on.
Yeah, well, like just kind of talk about it in general and the pluses and the minuses and why certain choices were made by me, as well as in conjunction sort of maybe with other members of the Earthdawn team in terms of what we're putting our focus on when it comes to Sourcebooks.
Okay, so where did this come from?
Okay.
What was the discussion you saw? Where did you see it?
So
I want to play interviewer.
Yeah, the Iopos sourcebook is focused on the city of Iopos, the people and personalities and
movers and shakers
within it, but also like the various, like the culture of, things that are important to the everyday citizen, the various government agencies and ministries that operate within the city and the stuff that they cover.
Yeah, and what it's like to live there, what it's like to visit.
And stuff like that. And, obviously we've got information on various members of the Denerastus clan and stat blocks, basic stat blocks for some of them and things like that. But the book does not delve into deep lore questions about the outcast, for example. The great dragon Denerastus, who is the forebear and progenitor of the Denerastus clan. It doesn't get into that. It doesn't really get into his history with the other great dragons. If anybody caught I did a live stream on Twitch with Cliff and Opti from the Arcology podcast and the Legends of Earthdawn game, actual play game. And I talked a little bit about the secret history, the deep lore history behind the Denerastus and the Outcast and all of that kind of stuff. The book does not really get into that.
And we've touched on it here a couple of
we sort of touched on it here a little bit. The book doesn't really get into that. The Elven Nations source book, to go with another sort of book that people might expect to have a lot of deep lore, ancient immortal secrets hidden in it, doesn't really get into that very much either.
Yeah.
The reason for that mainly is that while the story of the immortals the story of the powerful movers and shakers, the great dragons, the immortal elves, you know, the Denerastus clan and things like that, in terms of like what is actually going on behind the scenes and the relationships between these powerful individuals is interesting. And part of that is an echo of the old relationship between Earthdawn and Shadowrun, where you had stuff in Shadowrun that was the result of relationships that were established thousands of years earlier in the prior age of magic and things like that. And there is like following the stories of these characters and their relationships and the things that go on between them is really, really interesting. And I do not deny or dispute that in any way. That's part of what drew me into Earthdawn in the first place. Right. Yeah. Was that connection and like, oh, hey, maybe we can find out what actually does Harlequin's title as the last Knight of the Crying Spire refer to? Mm-hmm. You know, and things like that. It's
well, yeah, that's why I didn't play D&D. There was no Metaplot at all.
Well,
unless you pick one from a novel somewhere, but in the game books there was no plot. So Earthdawn at least started with
there was again you need to divide Dungeons and Dragons, the game system, from the stuff that happened in the settings, right? Forgotten Realms had events that happened. Right. That were maybe described in the novels, but there were also things that happened in adventure supplements and things like that kind of developed an ongoing story. So they had a metaplot as well. But one of the issues that you can potentially run into when you focus so much on the powerful movers and shakers, the leaders of nations, great dragons, immortal elves, and focus on their stories, is you can leave, you might not, trying to figure the best way to put this. You don't leave room for the stories of the player characters, who should be the focus of play at any table, should be the protagonists, the main characters in the story.
Yeah.
And having these powerful characters as background agents or movers and shakers or patrons or whatever can certainly help inform and enrich your game. You run into what is sometimes referred to as the Elminster problem. To reference Dungeons & Dragons again, which is to say that Elminster is this super duper powerful wizard, like chosen of the gods kind of thing in the Forgotten Realms, and frequently will like there's some of the worst adventures from like second edition AD&D where the player characters are going along as this powerful, like at behest of this powerful NPC, and then at the end that powerful NPC shows up and solves the problem. Like there's a real risk of deprotagonization of the characters, of removing their agency and their ability to make choices and to like
impact
what's going on.
Yeah, they just become hangers on.
Yeah, and if you've got source books that focus too much on the outcast and Alakia and stuff like that, you run the risk of having problems. I kind of talked about this a little bit when we were going over the history and talking about the war. And like why I made the choice that I did in terms of having 4th edition, like skip ahead of the war and just kind of describe what happens, is that there are some potentials. Like it's really interesting in one sense from a story point of view in terms of the ongoing story and development of Barsave as a setting and the characters that are within it.
Yeah.
But at the same time, how gameable is it? And I wanted the Iopos book to be something that would be a lot more broadly gameable for any, like, basically, here is a book that describes this city and the people and personalities and places and important stuff and some rumors and ideas about how you can use that in your game.
Yes.
Rather than, and now here is a 200-page novel that just basically describes all of the stuff going on behind the scenes. That, how applicable is that going to be to a game that's not focused on
the player characters?
But right. I mean, if a game is not focused on the high level machinations of these powers, how useful is that book going to be to them? And I want a book that is at least going to be more broadly useful.
Agreed.
And you run into some other issues when it comes to Metaplot, and Metaplot was a big thing in the 90s when Earthdawn came out. I think Earthdawn handled it better than some other games.
A lot of other games.
And I think Prelude to War is a really, really good example of a way that a game can shake up its setting while having the player characters involved in the things that are going on.
Mm-hmm.
But there are some pretty bad examples, and I won't go dissing games that I have an appreciation for. But, okay, actually I will. Nothing against it, but Deadlands, okay, which has a new Kickstarter out for a new edition of Deadlands is going on right now. So it's kind of contemporary, but it was a contemporary of Earthdawn back in the 90s.
Agreed.
And some of the stuff that happened with that game in terms of its story development and stuff that was going on in terms of either hiding things from the player characters and the game master, or having things that it didn't matter what the characters did, that certain events were going to take place. That there are some kind of bad, like there are some bad examples of like the bad things that can come about as a result of a Metaplot heavy game. And I am still interested in seeing Barsave develop as a living setting. But I want that to be something where those developments can be used by game masters to enrich and enhance their own games. Other potential drawback of a living setting like that, and where you kind of like are walking a balance, is, like I mentioned in a past episode, that like different campaigns are each in their own like slightly similar but parallel realities.
Yes.
Is that the longer a game goes on, and the more impact that those player characters have on the setting, the more that it ends up diverging from what we might have planned in terms of future story development. And so, again, it's like, with what has been learned about how people typically play games, how long their games tend to run in terms of campaigns, like what's typical, how do they approach it, trying to find a good balance of, well, let's give some good story stuff for them to maybe sink their teeth into and maybe make some changes, but how can we have like some suggestions or things in the books like, hey, if you're at this point and this NPC that we're talking about, you had killed in an adventure, well, here's maybe another way that you can approach that. Like trying to find multiple ways to, to work things out. Trying to approach something like that is very different than it is from, say, the Legends of Barsave mini adventures that we do, where we have a much more fixed, but as that goes on, right, and people are running their own games and maybe having those adventures interspersed with it, or whether they're doing it as the full, like, just adventure to adventure, those are the only things that they're running. How different groups might do different things. How can we try and accommodate as many variations as possible? And I don't think there's a single solution, unfortunately. It's just a matter of trying to if there were, I think it probably would have been solved as a problem by now.
No, I think you had the right idea.
It's like trying to find, because obviously one of the strengths of Earthdawn is the setting.
Yes.
Is Barsave and the wider world to a certain extent as well. But the story of Barsave and how it has been shaped from, when first edition kind of launched in that span, and then the return of the Triumph and the Second Theron War and the appearance, the revelation of the Denerastus as really kind of like a villain group to deal with, and the changes and the characters and everything, but to still allow, and to sort of continue that story, but still allow individual tables and player characters to have an impact on the setting and not feel like the problem that you sometimes run into when, say, people want to play a Star Wars role-playing game. Yes. Where, when are you going to set that? If you're going to set that at the height of the rebellion in the classic, like, Star Wars episode 4, 5, 6 story, well, all of the cool stuff is already being done by other people, maybe? Yes. Like, what are the, are your player character group going to basically be sort of just like supporting cast in the stories of Luke and Han and Leia? Or are you going to ignore what's going on there and do something somewhere else? Like, that's like how much, like, we want to tell the story. We want things to grow and change and provide frameworks and ideas for groups to, like, get involved in the story, and just trying to figure out the good way to do that. And actually, as of the time of this going up, I won't say anything more right now, but because the Kickstarter campaign has ended, there may be some hints or news that have just recently appeared or will be appearing along those lines.
Yes. So I think you had the right idea, which is this good to know? It would make a better 200-page novel, 300-page novel than a game supplement, because if it's just good to know, then tell a story about that. But do I want the characters to interact with it? If the answer is no, it's a novel.
Yeah.
If it's yes,
but at the same time, we can't.
And I think that's the dividing line. Is I don't want you to unseat the king. I don't want you to assassinate the head of state, because that's a whole different thing that changes everything about the city. I want you to interact with, the little people in there, the taverns and the bars and the hotels where you're going to be going and things. Maybe one of the king's aides or councilmen, sure, but you shouldn't go up higher up that tier than that. Even if you're 12th circle, I don't care. You shouldn't be interacting with the heads of state.
Well, I mean, if you're 12th circle, if you're 13th circle, you are one of a very select group of very, very powerful individuals, and you should be rolling and shaking the halls of power. Like,
agreed.
That should be the case. But
the book on its own is supposed to be accessible from first circle to 10.
Sure.
Whatever.
But the other thing, is like, we can't necessarily assume those of us who are like brined in the broth of this setting, who have been
eat, sleep, and drink it,
who have been soaking in it for 25 years.
What? Us? No, not you, not me.
And know the history and lore of this fictional land more than we perhaps know the real history and lore of our own home nation. But we can't assume that other people have that same depth of knowledge.
Agreed.
And it's really interesting, and there's a little bit of a bubble that we can find ourselves in when we are like working on it a lot, or talking with who are obviously the more devoted and hardcore fans on Discord or Twitter, or sending emails to us and stuff like that, who are a lot more invested in it than, say, a group who is not heavily invested in it.
This is an alternate game between the other games they play.
Which is fine. Yeah. Like, hey, you're playing it. That makes me happy. Buy the books. We'll take your money. We don't care. Buy the books and leave them on the shelf.
Story. Yeah.
But the ultimate goal is to make game books, and that is to make books that people will use in their game, and not to make books that a collector will buy and read in order to master a certain amount of canon lore, which I will not get into in terms of like a secondary rant that I have about the overemphasis of canonicity and attention to like trivial details, and the problems that I think that has caused in pop culture as a whole over the past 20 years.
Fair.
I want people to have stuff that they can use in their games and have a good time with in their games. And if there are aspects of that we can bring in some of these deeper lore secrets, great. But there are only so many pages in the book. We got to decide what to keep and what to cut. I would much rather have something that is going to be more broadly useful for a wide variety of groups than have, 3 pages that maybe only, 10 to 15% of our fan base actually give a damn about.
And that's the point, I think, to encapsulate your 15 minutes here into
15. I only went 15.
I didn't keep track. We'll go with 15. Sure, maybe 20. It's simple. The game books are to make generalizations, a lot of generalizations, because not everybody can use everything in them. So they can grab what they need to, grab the pieces that they need to, off like an a la carte salad bar, versus a novel tells one story.
Right.
And the game book should give you hints at like 50. And that's the point. So that's what a game book is for, is to drop hints advance a little bit of this and that, but tell you 50 different stories you can draw from, whereas a novel is one, maybe two at most stories that have a linear path to them. And that's the whole thing.
Yeah. And
so I think that's where to draw the line.
Sure. And I think if we wanted to investigate more sort of deeper lore stories, the places to do that would be either in like a dedicated fiction piece or to have it be something that is the focus of an adventure, like whether that's an adventure framework or something like that people could then take and basically show and like, okay, here is this thing. Here is how you can use this. Here is a framework. Here is an adventure where that comes into play.
And here's how we suggest you interact with that.
Yeah.
If you're going to interact with the head of state, here's how we suggest you interact with that.
Yeah. And there may be, there are aspects of that, but just, I don't know. I guess I'm done.
Fair enough. So speaking of the Iopos book real quick, and I know that is going to come out in 300 pages or so and be very, very detailed.
256.
We're going to talk about elves. 256. Fair enough.
I think it's the page count. I don't remember now right off the top of my head.
250 plus.
We'll
go with that.
Yeah, it's, I think it's 256.
But fairly detailed about a city that's only ever had like a paragraph or two about it beforehand. So we can kind of pivot off of that into the incredibly detailed nature of elves.
Elves.
Yes. So one of the other races we haven't quite gotten to yet because we have 8 in total for name givers.
Mm-hmm.
This is our, 4th or 5th? It's episode 25. So
we've talked dwarves, we've talked windlings, we've talked Tiskrang. I think this is number 4.
I think this is 4. All right. So
no, we talked humans as well.
This is number 5. They're so easy to forget.
No, so this is number 5.
So elves. Finally. As one of my players always calls them, the daisy munchers. Because he always assumes elves are vegetarian. I don't know why, but he does. One of those things. But for preparation for today, I reread the essay, most of the essay, on the elves from the Denizens of Earthdawn Volume 1, and I was reminded, because I honestly don't have a lot of players that play elves. And if they do, they kind of do their own little take on them, not necessarily the Earthdawn hewing to the line of elves.
Yeah.
But I did a comparison between the elvish essay and the human essay. And the human essay, as I said, I think had a lot of filler. The elvish essay was so intricate and so detailed and so vast that I was like, oh, this is a lot to take in.
Yeah.
It's immense.
Elves, like in RPGs in general, elves tend to, depending on the individual, tend to be, like, not get a lot of respect. Like, people are tired of elves. Like, elves are, the elves are the ancient, the long-lived, magical, pretty boy. Snooty, whatever. Yeah. That there's, like, you've got, the elves, like, going back to Tolkien. You've got that. You've got the elf situation in the Dragonlance setting for Dungeons and Dragons. For Forgotten Realms, has its whole own elf thing as well. And so... and there's
the drow elves and that whole sect.
And so there is, understandably so, because elves are often presented as better than you, that there is an understandable backlash, an understandable perception of them as the, for lack of a better term at the moment, the 1%. Whether that is entirely deserved or not. I know...
They remind me of Badger from Firefly as far as the perception is concerned. I'm above you, better than. And that's not how elves are done in Earthdawn.
No. I think Earthdawn does a couple of interesting things with elves.
Yeah. So we're here to clarify that and set the record straight on your Earthdawn elves at the least.
Yeah.
And... try and convince you to play them the Earthdawn way when you're playing Earthdawn and not bring any preconceived otherwise notions, again, from Tolkien or D&D or anywhere else into your Earthdawn play of elves.
First off is that elves are people. Like there is the same kind of variety of personalities and outlooks and temperaments that you're going to find in elves that you are going to find in any other name-giver race.
Yes.
That because of the mixing, the sort of cosmopolitan melange the stew, the melting pot of Barsavian culture that is the result of everybody basically needing to shelter in cares together for hundreds of years.
Mm-hmm.
There is an elven culture, but we're going to kind of set that aside for the moment because that's its own thing. But we will, I'm sure, mention that or address that at some point. Mm-hmm. But for the most part, the vast majority of elves that you are going to encounter in Earthdawn are just other folks that live side by side with dwarfs and humans and so forth.
And for generations have been doing so.
Right. Now, those generations are...
not elven generations.
A little bit longer.
Yes, they do live hundreds of years.
You know, because elves are a little bit longer lived. I think that, you know, that causes potential problems when it comes to setting development. I won't really go into that now. Nope. But for the most part, you can just treat elves as people that just happen to be maybe a little bit taller on average, have pointy ears, maybe, you know, but
a little prettier on average,
maybe a little bit prettier, you know, or more sociable on average. But unless you're talking about isolated, intentionally or not, racial enclaves that are predominantly elf by a significant margin, elves are just people, and for the most part will have the same sort of concerns and, you know, day-to-day whatever that their neighbors have based on where they live.
Yeah. Now, a couple of things about the elves that are similar to the Tiskrang is that they are always ruled by a queen.
Well,
so always a queen.
That's that's where we get into now. This is where the the Earthdawn taking the stereotype and twisting it works again in the game's favor. Is that
totally
the elves are ruled by a queen, but the whole thing with the queen and the elven court is taking that stereotypical idea of the hoity-toity nose in the air better than you elves and just making it not a broadly elf thing, but it is a thing for this particular sect of noble elves, you know, who have their reasons for being the way that they are and are quite often, as a result, portrayed as, you know, not really being like, it's not portrayed as an awesome thing, right? Yeah. Like the general, I've always felt that the general perception of Alakia and the other higher ups in the Elven court in Bloodwood is not broadly favorable to them. Again, I love Alakia. I think she is a fascinating character. I have gone on at length about her here and in other places. She is a tragic figure. She is in some ways an absolutely horrible, despicable person, you know, but I like it takes that and it says, yeah, like these elves have that attitude that they are better than you and they are like the best and masters of everything and whatever. But, you know, they make mistakes and do ill-informed, rash decisions and like, because that particular group of elves is so Greek mythology in terms of like the levels of their passions and the scope of the decisions that they make, the consequences of those are equally like broad and far reaching. And it kind of does that and says, no, in some ways, because they're immortals and know a whole lot about magic, they are better than you, but when they make mistakes, oh boy, do those mistakes, they make mistakes with a capital M. You know, their mistakes are as equally epic. And so
they last a long time.
Yeah. And there is even in that respect, there is a humanity to the elves, to the older elves, to the more powerful elves that just, is a little bit different. And then, you know, the blood elves, the thorn elves themselves are just a really cool concept.
Yeah. So basically there's we can start here. There's two different kinds of elves I can't say to play, but to know about in Earthdawn. There's the Bloodwood elves,
also called the protected elves, as they call themselves,
who have gone through the Ritual of Thorns. And then there's everybody else.
Right.
Because the Bloodwood elves built a wooden care for the Scourge that failed. Therefore, they had to go through the
again,
thorns.
epic decisions, epic disasters.
Epic failure. And then there's everybody else, the other elves who were not in Wormwood at the time and stayed in cares of mixed races and everything else. And so there was, again, no monoculture in there. So there's the other elves and there's the Bloodwood elves.
Right.
And if you want to play a Bloodwood elf, go ahead. It's a whole lot of fun. If you don't,
the rules
fine.
for them, the rules for
elves.
them for 4th edition, incidentally, are in the Elven Nations sourcebook.
Ha ha. Teaser. Go buy the book. And so there's that. But that decision that Alakia made for the Elven Court, and the Elven Court does not pass laws. They do not actually govern. It's more of a symbolic court that kind of sets the rules and tone for fashion, language, and rituals and arts and so forth and so on.
Well, what happened is that they sort of did long ago.
Yes, long ago.
But, people are people, and things change over time.
Yes.
And elves, like everybody, all the other name givers that we've been discussing, are not a monoculture, right? Is that while because of their longer lives, there was more of a sense perhaps of a larger like elven nation, elven community that spanned not just the wood, which was supposedly like the birthplace of the elves, but also, the Western kingdoms and Shosara and Thera, which is descended from, like, is the result of, again, epic
decisions by the Elven Court.
Epic decisions by the Elven Court. But that there is not, that over the course of the centuries, particularly when you have the Scourge, which broke, again, fewer generations as far as elves are concerned, but still a long period of time in isolation, those are going to develop their own cultures, their own ideas, their own beliefs.
Yeah.
And kind of go from there. There is, I think, more for the elves than any of the other name giver races. Because of the longer lifespan, there is more of a sense of long-term shared history among the elves that now has a very complicated relationship with being an elf because of what has happened to the wood. And as a player, if you are going to be playing an elf, you can play that up or down or whatever to varying degrees. Like it has now been long enough since the end of the Scourge that you've got elves who are, growing up now in adolescence and in their 20s or whatever that, don't feel that no longer maybe feel any kind of cultural debt or connection to the wood, because the only elven court that they've known is the isolationist, corrupted bit of the elven court. And maybe they feel, that they maybe feel more loyalty to their home, that the elves of, of the city of Europa feel more in common with their fellow European human and dwarf and orc and troll neighbors than they do with the court at Wormwood, which is weeks' journey away on foot. And that, like the appearance of a blood elf in Europa would be like remarkable. They probably are there, but it's just because it's so far away that it doesn't have any kind of bearing on the day-to-day lives. Yeah.
There's no cultural, it's like the grandparent you never see.
Right.
You know that they exist. You might remember their name.
You are aware of them. There are.
You don't have any idea of their perception of the world and their involvement in it.
Yeah. There are stories and legends and things like that tie into them, but you're, perhaps how some how some people in the U.S. like maybe feel connections back to the old country.
Yes. If you're 1 or 2nd generation removed or immigrating from, Germany or Poland or Spain
or China
Mexico
or whatever. Yeah.
Exactly. So there's a long, deep, complicated role that the elves have played. I can't say behind the scenes, but throughout Barsave's history.
And it's fascinating and it's worth exploring if you want to, but But don't feel like you need to define your elf character by that if you don't want to explore it.
Yeah. Because, I mean, even in the essay, they say that they've been ruled by the last 4 queens. So that's why I got the whole thing. They've been ruled by a queen almost forever because they've never mentioned any kings.
No, it has always been queens, but the reason for that is because in a lot of cases, it's the same queen coming back again and again.
Yeah. So
because again, I love her, but she is a garbage person.
Great antagonist, not somebody you want to meet in real life. Yeah, because there was Queen Dahlia who got slain by Alames, the dragon. And then there was Queen Phyla. And then the short-lived Queen Liara, who was replaced now by Queen Alakia. So there were those 4 in the last succession.
Well, 4, and I am doing air quotes around that, because at least one of those others was also Alakia.
Yes. So.
And depending on how you want to spin it, maybe all of them except the one who was killed by Alames might have been Alakia. I don't actually think so, but it's possible. She was also queen. It's hypothesized that she might also be Cainreth. Like the story of the first elf is her. She's talking about how awesome she is talking about how awesome she is.
So we have a narcissist on the throne.
Oh yeah. Oh.
Okay. Just making sure.
We won't go into this here, but track down some of my conversations and discussions about Alakia in the past. Like she is
a malignant narcissist. Okay.
Well, I don't know that I don't know that I would go so far as to say she's a malignant narcissist, but
does she make the world's best decisions?
Well, no, that doesn't necessarily. Anyway.
Yes, sorry.
So it is really interesting. It is worth exploring if it's something that you want to do, especially if you want to have a campaign that is focused, at least to some extent, on the Bloodwood or the other Elven nations. But it is by far not the only thing that you need to deal with if you're an elf.
No, somewhere in the back of your mind as a character, somewhere in the back of your racial culture and your history as an elf, you'd like the reparation of the elven court. You'd like the Ritual of Thorns to go away, because that's a stain on your...
Sure, and incidentally, we are pretty much talking about Barsavian elves here. Yes. There are elves in other parts of the world that really could not care less about what's going on. like elves in Thera, for example. But in other, in other parts of the world and provinces. But we're talking about Barsave, so...
Yeah, pretty much. But there is the aspect of the elven development as a person from birth to death, where they have, and this is the rich part and the fun part of their history, so it's just something to know as part of your character that you make. They have what they call is the Wheel of Life. There's 5 different paths that they will eventually follow: warriors, scholars, travelers, sages, and lords. That's it. So lords are the end of life if they get to live that long. Warriors usually the first part when you're fighty and don't quite know who you are yet. Then you move on to the scholarly aspect where you get to learn more about the world. You get to travel. That's the traveler aspect. Then there's the sage where you're wise and you get to tell everybody else about it because you like to tell stories. And then there's the lords, which is, I've been there and done all that.
Right.
So that's that's essentially the thing.
Sure. Yeah.
What I like to do for role playing, if anybody wants to play an elf, I'm like, okay, so how old do you want to be, and exactly what path do you want to be on? Because as soon as you transition from like warrior path to scholar path, your new discipline eradicates your old discipline, and you get to learn something new. So
yeah, that's messy,
but it's just fun. It's messy. It's like I said, it's fun, but usually nobody wants to delve this deep into elves.
Yeah,
when they're playing characters. Like, just give me a sword, let me hit something.
I mean, it's one of those things that is fascinating culturally. It's interesting to possibly explore as a character. It's another aspect of like personality and philosophy that kind of underlies a lot of the stuff going on in Earthdawn. It can,
or to harken back to 20 minutes ago, it's great for a novel.
The problem that you run into is that the mechanics don't always. What do you like? Basically, how do you make that gameable in terms of, I want to make an elf who's an adept and is on the path of sages, which means they're a lot older, but they presumably have all of this past experience and but we're starting with sort of inexperienced characters, how do you balance this character who has 2 centuries or a century and a half or whatever of experience and accumulated knowledge, and have that be mechanically balanced, at least passingly, with,
or at least represented.
And so that can be a difficult path to walk. And I don't think that we really, I think they sort of address it in the Denizens book. I don't recall that we really address it at all in the
Elven Nations.
In the Elven Nations book. I think one of the things, because personally, I think trying to tie, because first off, the vast majority of elves, like in the essay when it's talking about the different paths, it talks a lot about, these are the disciplines that are followed. The vast majority of elves don't follow a discipline. The vast majority of elves are not adepts. And so for that to be, the guiding philosophy of elfdom, but not really address very effectively how that works for the vast majority of elves that would be following that cultural idea
elves.
is a little bit weird. And so I would rather, I mean, it talks about the and not having it right in front of me, I'm going to mangle the pronunciation, the Daemystistia and the Samististia. I think I'm pronouncing that correctly, or pretty close.
Hang on. Yeah, I'm here somewhere.
I forget exactly. Again, not having the spelling right in front of me. But like, and having that sort of as different schools of thought, and the strict followers being the ones that maybe are a lot more in terms of stuff, and then the vast majority are actually loose followers because they don't have the capacity to actually follow things so strictly. Again, I think it is something that on the one hand makes sense as far as a cultural group that is long-lived, and so would have maybe a different approach to time and cycles of life and whatnot that would not be found among shorter-lived folk.
Yes.
But when it comes to making game rules for how that interacts with magic, it gets messy. And I think it starts interacting with the idea of renaming and changes to patterns and all sorts of weird stuff that conceptually I think is kind of cool, but from a practical, typical gameplay standpoint gets troublesome.
It mired down in the details. I did find the words in the essay.
Mired down in, from my standpoint, kind of irrelevant details.
Fair. I'm okay with that. So yes, it is Sa Mistish Shah, which is SA apostrophe for the first one, and then Dai Mistish Sa. So MISTISHSA. Mistish Sa.
Yeah,
yes.
I knew there was like another extra S or something weird in there that I couldn't remember.
Yeah, it's because there's 2 S's around an H, so it's a sh and then a sa, so it's blah. And again, it's Sperethiel, so there you are.
Yeah, it's Sperethiel. It's a made-up language.
Yeah, totally. The other aspect about elves, and again, this is where I find elves and Tiskrang rather similar, is female is in charge, so it's one of those things. But otherwise, the elves absolutely love rituals.
Yes.
They have a ritual for birth. They have a ritual for naming. They have a ritual for death. They have a ritual for changing your path in life. They have a ritual for, they have rituals upon rituals. Most things actually based upon the number 3. They have three women only allowed for around a birth, the mom, and then the 2 nurse aides. They name within 3 days. Used to be 21, but they now name within 3 because they didn't want to have unnamed kids dying in cares. But they have, and there's 3 witnesses for the naming path as well. And they reach maturity about 20 years old or so, but they absolutely freaking love rituals.
Yeah. And to grossly speculate here for a moment, if we want to talk about some deep lore stuff, it would be interesting to speculate about how much of that aspect of their culture is as a result of the magical knowledge and practices of the immortals that sort of shaped the early elven society.
Fair.
And things that kind of went along there, that a lot of the rituals and practices that are now kind of ingrained in certain aspects of elven culture are no longer magical things that maybe had been magical in the past or something.
Fair.
that's an interesting thing to go. And again, while that is something that is talked about a lot in the Denizens essay, for elves that are not quite so elfy, those sorts of things might be less important. I mean, for crying out loud, we were talking last episode about the To the Saddleborn, the story at the beginning in the fiction piece at the beginning of the 4th edition book. Davin is an elf, right? The main character, the one of the focal point characters of that story is an elf youth, and like joins up with, ends up at the end of the story sort of joining up with an orc cavalry band. And while he is still young and impressionable, and I could certainly foresee down the road having him being a bit more orky in his outlook as he kind of, as he kind of adapts, and perhaps to prove himself to those among the band who do not appreciate him coming and being part of them, needing to go above and beyond to prove himself as like more orky than orc kind of thing. There's a lot of interesting things that you could do with a character like that.
Oh, totally.
Yeah. Again, like the information provided is just one set of ideas or one possible avenue to explore.
Yeah.
And just the reminder that much like the essays on the individual disciplines are not the only way to do things, the information on the races is not necessarily the only way to do things.
The race. Yes. So it's just, I found it that the level of rituals laid out was just intricate and detailed.
Yeah.
And again, very robust. If you want to write a novel about an elf, draw from all of that. It is absolutely. But other things to know about elves, just in general, in Earthdawn, is anything that they craft, weapons, clothes, armor, it is always pretty. It's never just functional. It's never just a sword, because they have a beauty of form that matches the efficiency of the function. And so it's always going to be ornate or pretty, but still it's going to work.
And there is traditionally, because of the legendary and historical ties to the Bloodwood and Elven court, there is and as it was Wormwood before the Scourge, there is a strong appreciation among the elves for nature and natural motifs and designs when it comes to things like that.
And if they have a favorite element, it's always wood, because again, from Wormwood, Bloodwood, whenever they do their naming ritual in the forest, they prefer to sleep under nature. They prefer, they didn't like being in caves, but nobody did, but they gravitated toward anything that was leafy and green and woodsy. And then even their dying ritual, they prefer to die outside. Versus, if they're in a building, carry them outside. That's their preferred way. So just one of those things. They are very in tune with nature. Another thing that is their language, Sperethiel, is mostly a spoken language. It's dying out as a written language. So a little story note you can include there somewhere.
Outside of the wood.
Because when they were in the cares, they didn't have enough for writing materials because, food and other things took a priority.
Right.
So
and because of the Book of Tomorrow and the predominance of Throlic as the language of the common tongue and the primers that were provided so that people would be able to learn to read and write Dwarven instead of their own tongues when they were sort of emerging centuries later.
So it's just these little tiny character notes I find you can kind of hang on to or write something about your character about to say they're learning the written Sperethiel later on. That's what they want to do, and so they can add a skill slot for that for read and write language or so forth. But just one of those things, that can be a little thing in there somewhere that you find maybe a text of written Sperethiel and nobody can read it. So you have to go find somebody who can. So little things like that. Elves generally love to paint, sculpt, dance, and sing, and most of those are artisan skills are handed down from generation to generation, so it's mostly learned by their parents, not just somebody down the street in their family. Family is huge for them, but they typically only have one offspring, not 6. Because
they tend to have smaller families. I do want to address simple math. The fact that if you have a culture that only has one child, they will die out. Yes. And so anytime you're talking about, they typically only have one child, no. If they want to maintain a population, You need to a replacement level population. Each couple should have 2 children. At that point, you're not growing or, or shrinking. But if you talk about, they, on average, they have 1 child. Well, replacement population needs to come from somewhere.
Exactly. But to make the point between Earthdawn and Shadowrun, eventually everybody but humans dies out. And then the level of magic comes back for Shadowrun, so you have elves again.
Right, but that's different.
Yeah, that's way down.
That is a different situation. But what I'm talking about is the idea that they tend to have smaller families. Let's say again, talking about traditional elven culture, they tend to have smaller families as opposed to the larger broods that
orcs,
humans, and orcs are the ones that tend to be tend to be larger,
plentiful.
But yeah, that's there's a the realities of the sort of agrarian lifestyle that is kind of the actual baseline for Earthdawn does require larger families. Certainly there is probably not the high level of infant mortality that you would have had in the first 15, prior to 15. Modern medicine and stuff.
Yes.
But, because magic and the passions and stuff can probably do a lot to mitigate things like that.
Well, especially since they have so much magic around their birth and death cycles that probably, prevented a lot of...
There is some asset. But again, but for the purposes of, for a Bronze Age, Middle Age, medieval sort of thing,
yes,
the very fact, the labor that is, again, there is probably magic labor-saving stuff when it comes to farming and whatnot, but you still need hands to do the work.
Yes.
And so consequently, you are going to, it might be that the nobility, it might be that the upper classes, it might be that the more powerful individuals tend to have smaller families, but I suspect that the common folk probably tend to have larger broods as a result.
Yeah, totally. Just for necessity, as you said, to get the work done, whatever the work. Yeah,
to get the work done, and stuff like that. Yeah. It's traditional for them to have only 1 child. Well, then after a certain number of generations, they're going to be extinct.
Dead. Yes, totally.
So
smaller type families.
Well, I mean, you may be quoting the book, but that's a case of me going, this is a case where you think through the consequences of what the book says, and it's not, doesn't quite work out.
No, it was just, they tend to have, like I said, smaller families. I misquoted. I misspoke on that.
Okay.
But other than that, that's just a couple of things to keep in mind when playing an elf. They have a very rich culture, divided as it may be, between the protected elves and the non. And then they're very long-lived, and so they are more patient than most. And again, this is where they come off as snooty, but they're not. They're just introspective.
There was actually I want to actually address that.
Fair.
The idea of, because they are long lived, they are more patient and less
impulsive, I think was the word used.
Somebody I recently came across something, I think it was on Twitter, where somebody was talking about elves and saying it doesn't actually make sense for them to do that because the seasons aren't patient. They would still need to, if they're going to be growing, unless you're talking about a basic hunter-gatherer lifestyle, which is not generally what's presented for elves, whether in Earthdawn or other fantasy games. But planting does not wait. You need to plant and you need to grow your crops within a certain time frame, and those are not affected by your long lifespan. Now, it might be that over the course of your many, many more decades, you might take a slightly different approach to your relationships with other name givers, particularly shorter lived ones. Or you might end up how an older elf deals perhaps with hobbies or things that they practice in their spare time are apt to become a lot more practiced and expert, or might be dabblers in a whole bunch of little stuff. But some of the basic aspects of the world and time itself are not going to bend simply because you live for 300 years and can take a little bit longer to practice the guitar.
Yes.
So a lot of that is human projection onto, well, gee, like we only live 70 to 80 years. If we live for 300 years, we would be able to like relax and enjoy our time and be able to appreciate like these things better. Well, no, because it still takes, like, you still need to plant your crops and grow them and harvest them so that you can eat. Like that is a cycle. Yeah. That is a cycle that is not going to is not going to matter how long you live in the grand scheme of things. So that is a very, very valid thing to keep in mind. And again, something else that like, if you want to like explore the idea of long-lived peoples and whatnot, that's fine. But you know, again, your common elf, like living in a village in the plains, they need to go and take in the harvest alongside their human neighbors
and
dwarven neighbors, just like everybody else does. You know, if they want to eat, they need to work the same way that anybody else would. And, you know, again, maybe the wealthy or the nobles who have the resources to not need to work to that extent can perhaps afford to take
longer term think in terms of what happens over the next 10 years versus the next year
and to whatnot. Yeah. And so I think that is definitely something to keep in mind. Anything else that you wanted to bring up?
No, I got it. That's pretty much it.
We want to talk real briefly mechanics. Elves are
sorry.
Nope, that's fine. I don't want to belabor the mechanics too much because there's not too much to go into it, but I do just want to make sure we touch on it.
No, because we should. It's equal across all podcasts that we do.
Yeah. Elves get a notable bonus to dexterity. They get a +2 bonus to dex.
Yep.
They are penalized by having a toughness penalty, which means that elves are fast, agile, like they can make good swordmasters.
Oh, absolutely.
Warriors, you know, because they get a notable bonus compared to humans in terms of their ability to hit. Their strength is average, so that's fine where it is. Obviously not as good as, say, orcs or trolls or obsidian who all get pretty hefty strength bonuses. But that toughness penalty is something that if you're going to be making a combat type as an elf, you may want to invest more into, like when you're selecting your optional talents, taking talents that are going to play into your dexterity bonuses to make it harder for you to be hit, so that you are not penalized so much by the fact that you are going to generally have, at least, especially to begin with, lower health ratings and a lower wound threshold, especially. Getting hit if you are a physical combat type as an elf can be pretty rough. So you want to...
Since we covered game mechanics last time around, or a couple of episodes ago, carry a shield, because that'll up your physical defense.
Right. I mean, you know, on top of that. You know, and then elves get a minor bonus in perception, willpower, and charisma, which means elves generally make actually really good troubadours because they have the charisma, and spellcasters as well. They, you know, so those
perception, willpower bonuses,
the perception and willpower bonuses, they are you know, traditionally good spellcasters. The charisma bonus makes them good as a beastmaster. If you're going for someone who's more wild, or a troubadour, or an air sailor. About the only disciplines that elves tend to be a little bit more struggly on are sky raiders and warriors, primarily because of their toughness penalty. They tend to not quite have the recovery tests to power some of the iconic abilities of those disciplines, and so they tend to archer, because then you're at range. And you're taking advantage of the high dexterity, and you don't need to worry so much about toughness. And Swordmaster, who tend to be focused more on dexterity-based avoidance talents like maneuver or the like, to make it harder to hit. But the talent option, you know, with 4th edition, with the ability to do talent options, it is certainly with the options that you pick for a warrior or something to go along similar lines in that regard.
And I think Archer and Swordmaster are like quasi-typical for elves anyway. Almost.
Yeah. Just stylistically, they tend to, I mean, Elf Archer is like kind of iconic. I mean, you've got Legolas. Karma modifier
Who, by
of
the
4.
way, in Earthdawn would not be able to walk on snow. So, no.
Karma modifier of 4, they don't quite have the same karma reserves that a human or an orc would have, or a windling, obviously, but they're on par with Tiskrang and dwarves. So they're not really hampered in that regard. Their movement rate is 14, which means they are faster than everybody except trolls, who have a 14 movement rate as well because they are taller and have a longer stride.
Yeah, longer leg span. So,
the elves are like agile, quick, fast, don't have the karma reserves, hampered a little bit on disciplines that provide a little bit more emphasis on physical toughness, but are pretty good otherwise. So if you're going to be going in the close combat arena, going for the defensive type builds is probably better than the more offensive, aggressive approaches that you might see from a Sky Raider or offensively built warrior.
So if you're thinking of playing a human as something, or an elf as something, or Tiskrang as something, they're kind of all almost fairly equal in those regards.
Yeah, I mean, they're none of the, you get a little bit extreme with the windlings. We haven't talked about them yet, but you also have some extremes with the Obsidian. You're kind of extreme in some regards with the troll simply because of the physical size. But for the most part, human, dwarf, elf, Tiskrang, orc are all like, they've got things that they are a little bit better at than others, but the bonuses or penalties that they get in most cases, while they tend to lead them in certain directions, are not significant enough that you can't make something work if you want to.
Yeah. I have a new appreciation for elves. I don't have a lot of elf characters played in my game, but going through the essays again, I am reminded that it is a very rich and detailed culture, that if you want to bring aspects in for your character, by all means. If you want to forget it all, by all means do that as well.
Yeah.
It's because, as to Josh's major point, the elves that grew up in Cares with everybody else, there's naturally no monoculture. They're going to take on the aspects and personality types of the people that they grew up with. So it is as carte blanche as humans, as dwarves. Pretty much. So, any final thoughts?
No, I think that about covers it.
Cool. We did not, however, on this podcast, remind people to email us. By all means, if you have any questions or suggestions about elves or your elf histories, stories, whatnot, feel free to email us at edsgpodcast@gmail.com. And to Josh's point, the Iopos Kickstarter has ended. So if you missed it, sorry, but you shouldn't have missed it. And the book will be out here. The book will be out here as quick as it possibly can, but the backers get those first.
The backers have access to the pre-release draft, so they will be able to see everything that's in the book ahead of time. As soon as we get all of the art back and finalized on the layout, the PDF will be available, as soon as we can get that finished and up. Print books, we're hoping to have that at some point during the summer, but we are living in a pandemic world, and we're not exactly sure. As of right now, sort of things are on track to go on as planned, but who knows what may come down the line.
Absolutely.
So to keep up to date, follow me on Twitter. Or follow Facet Games on Facebook. Go to our forums. Go to the Facet Games Discord. We try and put news and announcements and stuff in as many places as possible, so that people can do it, and spread the word about the new book, about Earthdawn. Like, we had an email back at the beginning of the episode from somebody who was not aware of 4th edition.
Yeah.
Let people know.
Or just the fact that there's new stuff, period. So
yeah,
it's all useful. Until next time, folks, and that'll be in a few weeks or so. Until next time, go make your own Daimishtisha legend.
Good night, everybody.